Back on the Young Turks. Now joining us for the first time, Bill deBlasio is public advocate for New York. He's got a very interesting proposal. Bill, welcome to the Young Turks.
Oh, great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. We appreciate it. Now, you've got a very interesting idea there in New York about the New York City pension funds. First of all, as a public advocate, what role do you serve in dealing with the New York City pension funds?
Well, I have a voting seat on on our biggest pension fund, the New York City Employees Retirement System. It is a fund of about $31 billion right now in investments, and it has 300,000 beneficiaries. And for that reason alone, I am deeply concerned about the effect of the Supreme Court decision. I'm also concerned as a citizen. I think it's going to fundamentally hurt our democracy. So I think it's bad for shareholders. I think it's bad for the political process. And for that reason, the crucial thing we have to work towards is full disclosure by corporations of all their political spending.
So, of course, we're talking about the Citizens United case that said that corporations have freedom of speech rights and that they can spend as much as they want on elections and campaigns. So, since you guys are part of the people who own the corporations by investing the pension funds in these corporations, it makes perfect sense to exercise your judgment on these issues. So what is it specifically, Bill, that you want to happen?
Well, let me just start by saying this. This Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, I can't emphasize enough how it's going to fundamentally change our country. And if we don't act soon, it's going to change our country for the worse in a very profound manner. And I think if you need any evidence, just look at the fact that I don't think we've ever seen the President of the United States dress down the Supreme Court, live on national television during a State of the Union address. I thought that was an incredibly meaningful moment. I think this now means that people have to act with whatever tools are at their disposal. Consumers are going to have to think about the ramifications of this decision in terms of what product choices they make eventually. But right now, pension funds are at the front line. So what I'm saying is that pension funds all over the country should use their power to demand full disclosure by corporations of all their political spending. Now, we're reaching out to pension funds all over the country. When you add together the assets of the public pension funds in this country, it tops $3 trillion. It's an extraordinarily powerful force. We're specifically working as well with the Council of Institutional Investors, which is a national group of the largest pension funds, and they are helping us to try and move this concept of disclosure. We're trying to help move, of course, the efforts for legislation at the federal level to create limits and to push the SEC to act. We're going to need all these tools in play because this decision just alters everything. You're talking about an individual corporation could go into one election and alter the course of it on its own, spending its own Treasury money on independent expenditure campaigns. That's how fundamentally different the world could be if we don't put some limits on here. We're
talking to Bill deBlasio. He is a public advocate in New York. And Bill, I love this idea because this is what I've been saying on the show for quite a while. Look, these giant pension funds are the owners of a lot of these companies by being very important shareholders, and that you've got to give voice to those shareholders, otherwise you're doing yourself a disservice. So in this particular case, and I want to talk to you about other cases too, but in this case, what are the specific details of what you think that these pension funds should ask corporations to do in terms of political spending?
Literally to lay out exactly who's making the decisions, what amount of money is being spent, where it's being spent, when it's being spent, to literally the blow-by-blow of every political expenditure that's made. And that is not only important as a matter of freedom of information and protecting democracy. There's a huge bottom-line concern here, too. The pension funds are supposed to watch out for the millions and millions of beneficiaries out there whose futures literally will depend on how these pension investments do. Well, when you look at what happens to corporations that start to think they can game the system and win political advantages and win governmental favors through political spending and lobbying, what happens is they become less effective corporations. I hate to say it, but the auto industry in Detroit is a very good example of a protected industry that knew they had the favor of the government and unfortunately became less and less effective at doing their job. What I think might happen here is you end up with a corporate arms race where all these companies are trying to outdo each other to win elections, to influence legislation. And what it means is they'll be less effective. And you know what? Don't believe me. The International Monetary Fund did a study last year that showed the more companies spent on lobbying, the less strategic they were and the less profit-oriented they were in doing their work. University of Minnesota did an amazing study, very broad study, that looked at political spending. Same thing. The more companies get deeper into political spending, ironically, the less they think about the bottom line and actually producing a profit. That should concern every pension fund in America.
Well, there's that great, I don't know if they've ever done a case study on it, but I know that the facts certainly bear it out, where Phil Gramm was given a lot of money by lobbyists for UBS to deregulate, and then they took the deregulation and nearly bankrupted UBS with it. And the same argument could be made for Citigroup and what they did, in convincing the Clinton administration to deregulate, and then they wound up bankrupt because it's not in the interest of the corporations. It's in the interest of the executives who run the corporations. Now that brings me to point number 2, which is that shareholders don't have nearly enough power about how they run their own companies. And these executives are using you guys and all the people that you represent as suckers to take as much money as they possibly can out for themselves. Is there anything that can be done about that?
Well, I think there, thank God, is a movement over these last years to create, real shareholder democracy, to really to empower shareholders for all of the reasons we're discussing here. You're right. There have been so many instances of companies making decisions, of executives making decisions that were not in the long-term interest of the company, not in the long-term interest of the shareholders, and ultimately the folks who relied on the pensions through the pension funds. So what's happened is a deep desire for more and more disclosure, more transparency, a more activist group of shareholders in each company that actually demand accountability and look at what the ramifications of what the company is doing are, socially speaking as well, in terms of the environment and other matters. This is a very, very healthy trend, but it needs so much more work to really become commonplace that there is that kind of fundamental rights for shareholders. I think this moment, because of the Supreme Court decision, calls out for a nationwide campaign to assert shareholder rights right now before corporate spending on politics gets out of hand. And so I think by acting now to absolutely require disclosure across the board, it also helps to further the larger notion that shareholders are going to be much more intense in their efforts to make sure their companies are responsive to them.
Bill, I think if you led the charge on this, that it would do a world of good for shareholders, it'd do a world of good for the New York Pension Fund, and honestly, it'd do a world of good for your political career. Because I think that this is something that has not been tapped into, and somebody needs to be a voice for this. Because right now, I mean, we had another guest on here that explained how boards work. And corporate boards, the shareholders, the pension funds, don't get any vote at all. You can't even vote no on the boards. All you can vote is yes or abstain, which is ridiculous. So then Disney, for example, stacks their board with, at the time when he was running it, with Michael Eisner's dentist, his son's high school gym coach. I mean, this is absurd. So.
It's absurd, but here's the power of this movement. Even with all, the fix is in basically in most of these situations, and yet Michael Eisner was forced out because shareholders became increasingly angry. And even with poor democratic process within the corporate world, the anger of the shareholders still had a massive impact. So I think when it comes to the question of political spending, we don't have to take this line down. We don't have to say, the Supreme Court's decided, end of discussion. I think that pension funds have a role to play, as do all shareholders. I think consumers ultimately have a role to play in demanding information about what companies are doing and using that information as part of their decision-making on what to buy. If we sort of reassert our democratic rights using every tool we have, we can make sure this Supreme Court decision is not ruinous to democracy.
All right, and then finally, why do you think these specific proposals that you have here, listing the people who are making the decisions on what to spend on lobbyists, and listing, what kind of campaign contributions the company's making, et cetera, why do you think those will be so helpful?
Because I think what's going to happen is that the corporations are going to have to weigh the publicity that will be generated by full disclosure, and they're going to have to think long and hard about whether they want to go down the road of political spending and how they want to do that. That's just one of the approaches through the pension funds. By the way, I'm hoping that Congress will act and the SEC will act to not only require disclosure, but I'd like Congress to require a disclaimer on every television ad, every piece of mail that's paid for by a corporate treasury, that literally will have to force it to be said, this particular corporation paid for this political effort. I think if we keep demanding disclosure and shining a light, it's going to be harder and harder for corporations to think they can just have the benefit of the spending without the negatives of a public debate on whether the spending is right and whether their particular choices are right. As soon as it becomes clear that the corporations are trying to create, to change laws in their narrow favor and elect candidates who will do their bidding rather than the public act in the public's interest, that will change the entire political debate in this country. So this disclosure is a way to get to something much deeper, which is questioning what's appropriate for the corporate role in our political process.
Bill deBlasio, New York City Public Advocate, and apparently a voice for these pension funds, and I like it. Thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks.
Thank you.